Good evening. I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me on our news panel are Paul Rogers, environment writer for the San Jose Mercury News; Josh Richman, legal and political affairs reporter for the Oakland Tribune; John Myers, Sacramento bureau chief for KQED Public Radio, joining us from the Capitol. So, John, what are some of the details of Governor Brown's revised budget?
We don't hear him.
Notion that you have to solve the state's budget problem through a combination of spending cuts and taxes. Now, the governor and the legislature have already worked through roughly half of the deficit problem. He's pegging the remaining deficit at about $9.6 billion. But he is insistent that the tax plan move forward. This is an extension of current rates of sales taxes and car taxes. And this income tax surcharge, he has actually pushed forward a year, delayed it a year, but it's still in the package. And he still wants voters to approve all of that. Now, there are some modifications. Of course, the state's revenues look better than they did, about $6.6 billion more over the 2-year period of revenues than we thought we were going to have. So that's going to help schools. That's going to help some of the structural debt problems, the wall of debt. I love that term that Jerry Brown put out this week, the wall of debt that he wants to start chipping away at. But the fundamentals of the budget are the same. Cuts, taxes, the cuts have been done, and he's still got to get the taxes somehow through the Capitol.
John, we may have missed the first part of what you said. I want to make sure if there was a pearl of wisdom the first 5 seconds or so and you wanted to repeat it. Well, here's your chance.
I just simply, my basic point I think here is that this is a stay the course kind of budget from Jerry Brown. Its fundamentals are the same, spending cuts and taxes. And again, most of the spending cuts have been done. The hard work now, as it has been all year long for Jerry Brown, is these tax extensions that he has to get Republicans to go along with, either to put on the ballot or to approve themselves in the legislature. I don't think that one's going to happen. So he's got to get it somehow, get them on the ballot, somehow twist some arms of Republicans in the Capitol.
So John, that's the $10 billion question. Republicans haven't shown any inclination to give him the 2 votes in each chamber that he needs to either approve the tax extensions or to put him on the ballot. Does Jerry Brown have a plan B? And if he doesn't, how is this going to end? What's the end game?
Well, I love first of all, we could quote Jerry Brown all night long. I mean, he's an unbelievably quotable governor. And he had a quote in the profile in the New York Times Magazine a couple of weeks ago where he referred to his situation almost in the way that Cortez, the Spanish conqueror, did, where he allegedly landed on shore and burned the ships behind him. There is no plan B, was Jerry Brown's point. And I do think that is somewhat what we saw again this week in the revised budget. He did not lay out this grand plan of, if I don't get the taxes, here are all the things I'm going to cut. We actually thought we would see some of that. The governor's insistent the taxes have to be an option, but I do think that that's not going to be the way this lasts through the summer. And here's why. Because the state has to go to Wall Street at some point this summer and borrow money. This is part of the annual short-term bridge loan that we get because of the ebb and flow of taxes. The state's going to need roughly about $10 billion of short-term loans on Wall Street. And we are being told, both by State Treasurer Bill Lockyer and also this week by the Ledge Analyst and by Standard & Poor's, the credit rating agency, that Wall Street lenders are going to want to see some kind of alternative if the taxes don't happen, some kind of cuts, some kind of alternate plan. And I think at the end of the day, Brown and any other lawmakers are going to come up against Wall Street. Wall Street's going to win.
And John, what would make the Republicans give in on the taxes now that whereas they haven't up until this point? I mean, what's going to change?
Yeah, I think that's probably the question we're all waiting to answer, isn't it? I mean, the tough part here is figuring out exactly what Republicans in the state capitol want. I think there's some grumbling actually in Republican circles that perhaps they've already overplayed that hand, but they clearly want a package of what they would call reforms to go along with the taxes. If the voters are going to approve or are going to have a vote on the taxes, they want the voters to vote on pensions. They want the voters to vote on some kind of new cap on state spending. And gosh knows who knows what else they would have to vote on. And until we see the details of that, it's really hard to see, whether the Republican votes are there.
Okay, there are a couple of things. Number one, where did the money come from? And exactly how is the governor going to use what he now has in hand?
Well, the $6.6 billion, this windfall, and I actually would be really careful at using that term, Belva, now that I've put it out there. I think that the current year unexpected revenues, about $2.5 billion, are really the ones I would focus on. No one knows for sure. They don't know if it's high-income earners that their wages got better. They think maybe Wall Street, the stock market came back, and so capital gains have improved, but they really don't quite know where the money came from yet. And I think as a result, you are seeing Brown be relatively conservative with what to do with the money. His two biggest things are give the money to schools, and that's kind of the automatic formula that schools get funding, and try to chip away at some of this long-term debt, and that's actually a school funding issue as well. But Brown is not reinstating programs. He's not backing off a lot of other things. He's modified his tax plan in some ways, but it really still is the same plan if you look at it from January. Jerry Brown's pretty conservative. You know, he's legendarily kind of cheap in his personal life, and I think he's kind of applied that in state budgeting. He wants to be very careful and cautious, and I think that's what this budget reflects about spending money.
Well, before we move to Paul Rogers and one of those places the governor wants to cut, tell us how redistricting might help Jerry Brown.
Yeah, this is a fascinating part of it. I actually think it could help him more if it was like the old days and the legislature and the governor drew all those political maps. But there is a palpable sense of nervousness that you talk to people in the state capitol now, because the Independent Redistricting Commission is about to release draft maps in early June of where legislative districts, congressional districts are, and you got a lot of members of the legislature wondering where they're going to run, who their opponents are going to be, where they'll get their money for their campaigns. And I personally think that after those maps come out in June, you will start to see people start to know what the political calculus is of voting for this budget, especially Republicans, whether they can or cannot vote for the taxes, knowing who their constituents are going to be next year.
Well, Paul Rogers, we're going to move views. You're talking about one of the victims of this budget dance that everybody's doing, state parks and closures for them. Are you encouraged by the new revenues, or what are environmentalists saying about it?
Well, so far, the new revenues have not been applied in any way to state parks. Jerry Brown's original plan, which is to close 70 of the state's 278 state parks, remains in place. That's a quarter of the system. It's pretty dramatic. The 70 that would be closed are all over the state, and they were visited last year by 5.6 million people, which is more people than went to all the Giants, 49ers, and San Jose Sharks home games. So these are popular places. And what's coming out this week is that the State Parks Department, although they've been talking about this for a couple of years, they don't really have a plan. They're not sure specifically how they're going to actually close them. In other words, you say, well, are you going to write tickets to people? If there's a state beach, if a retiree is collecting shells walking along the beach, or a family puts down a blanket, are you going to write them a $400 trespassing ticket? They say they don't know yet. The Coastal Commission, actually, I have a story coming out in the paper over the weekend. The head of the Coastal Commission says under the state's Coastal Act, which is written into the Constitution, you cannot close off public access to the beach up to the mean high tide line, which basically means all the wet sand. And Peter Douglas, the head of the Coastal Commission, told me that if the state parks tries to put up any new gates, any new signs, or tries to block anybody from that shoreline area, they will need a permit from the Coastal Commission, which could take months and has public hearings and all sorts of things. The other question is, some of these parks are very large. Henry Coe State Park, or Samuel P. Taylor State Park in Marin. Henry Coe's in Morgan Hill. Henry Coe is 90,000 acres. That is 3 times the size of the city of San Francisco. It has 250 miles of old ranch roads and trails. And anyone can just walk in there. There's not a fence around it. You can ride a mountain bike. And so are they going to keep rangers there to write tickets? And if you do, where's your savings? So there's many hard questions that no one really has the answer to yet.
How much money did the administration think they were going to save from this?
Yeah, they say they're going to save $11 million this year and $22 million next year. And as we just heard John talking about, the state budget deficit, even with the, quote, windfall over the last couple of days, is still $9.6 billion. So the $22 million that it would save next year, or the 33 total, is about 1/3 of 1%. So you will close a quarter of the state park system, be the first governor since the park system was created in 1902 to ever close a state park to save money, and 99.7% of the deficit will still be there. So the obvious question is, that a lot of environmental groups are asking is, well, why are you doing this?
Yeah.
And a lot of political observers are saying it's because so many of the cuts under Schwarzenegger and even under Brown have affected the poor. They have not affected middle-class voters. And Brown and other administration officials want middle-class voters to feel some pain, to see something in their life affected, so maybe they will be inclined to vote for these taxes.
John?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, Paul, I mean, one of the things that I know that happened up here in Sacramento this week is we got some different revenue projections, just barely different, from the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office. And they're predicting revenues about $57 million higher than Brown. Now, people should know that's kind of budget dust, really, in a multi-billion-dollar deficit. But $57 million ain't a small amount of money when you're talking about parks and the savings there. Do you have any sense that the parks folks maybe have a priority list of, like, if they got money back, they would close these but not close those, or have they not gone that far?
You know, it's a good question, and some newspapers are already writing editorials saying, look, with the $6.6 billion, you know, half of that went to schools, half went back to reduce the deficit. Take a little bit out, put it into the state parks, keep most of them open. Particularly rural chambers of commerce, people, you know, that have motels, that sell gas, restaurants in some of these rural counties. Tourism is a big part of their economy. So, you know, in the end, who knows how this is going to come out, but it's very difficult to say politically, let's cut every other part of government but not parks.
Right.
Yet at the same time, the savings is virtually nothing.
Just a quick answer on nonprofits taking over parks.
There is a bill in the legislature right now, Jared Huffman, assemblyman from Marin, is carrying AB 42, that would allow nonprofits to run parks. But if you do that, there's still all kinds of problems. You don't have any peace officers with weapons. There's no EMTs, nobody with the radios that connect with the police system. So if you have a fight in the campground, who breaks it up? You know, nobody knows.
Well, there was quite a large and long fight in the legislature and in the Senate this week, where Professor Goodwin Liu was up for his hearing for elevation to the appellate court. Josh, you have that story, right?
Yes, 15 months after President Obama first nominated him to the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, and after 3 times through the Senate Judiciary Committee, this associate dean and professor from the Bolt Hall Law School at Berkeley had his moment, I suppose, or actually was ultimately denied his moment as the Senate failed to get enough votes to invoke cloture and end the debate and actually hold an up or down confirmation vote. The GOP had been against this guy right out of the gate, you know, from practically the week he was first nominated last February. They said he was too liberal and had too expansive a view of what judges could do in interpreting the Constitution. He had written something in a book he co-authored a few years ago about how judges should interpret the Constitution not according to how its general principles would have been applied in 1789 or 1868, but rather how those principles should be applied today in order to preserve their power and meaning in light of the concerns, conditions, and evolving norms of our society.
We have heard
that was
that
taboo
quote from
for a
other
lot of
judges,
people.
though, Josh.
Well, it's a school of thought. It's a judicial philosophy as to how what judges should be doing in terms of applying the Constitution. And this was taboo for a lot of conservatives. There's also there's a lot
of other things that set them off, right? He was the head of a liberal judicial society. He opposed Alito.
The American Constitution Society, and he had been very outspoken in against the confirmations of Alito and Roberts to some extent as well. So there was some allegation of tit for tat.
Well, let's turn to why he was nominated in the first place.
He's a Rhodes Scholar. He is a former Supreme Court clerk. He's pretty widely renowned as one of the nation's leading constitutional scholars. People go to him, you know, national media consult him all the time on this stuff, and he's generally perceived to be a brilliant legal mind. There are a lot of conservatives who said he was eminently qualified, and they just didn't happen to be conservatives in the Senate.
But he also, my understanding, has got the highest rating of the American Bar Association.
The American Bar Association said he was eminently qualified for this job. It was a somewhat coveted rating from the ABA.
What's interesting is the almost mirror image politics of a similar appellate court battle just a couple of years ago, the Miguel Estrada battle, where Bush nominated a guy who had graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, editor of Harvard Law Review, clerked for a Supreme Court justice. He was too conservative for the Democrats. They filibustered, and killed his nomination. In both cases, they were young guys who could have made it to the Supreme Court. And I think, tell me if you agree, I think they scared the people of the opposite party that, oh my God, Liu's only 40 years old. He could be on the Supreme Court forever. Estrada, I think, was 45 or something.
Right.
You know, these are young guys.
Let's clarify. He was going to the Ninth Circuit right now.
But he's in line.
But he could. It would have been a stepping stone to the Supreme Court. Yeah.
What happens in the aftermath of this, though, Josh? I mean, now what?
That's a great question. You know, I think we have to wait and see how some of the remaining judicial nominations are going to go. But the Democrats are saying that this sort of puts an end to the deal that was struck by the so-called Gang of 14 5 years ago. There were 7 Democratic senators and 7 Republicans who got together sort of outside the bounds of the leadership at the time to say we're only going to filibuster judicial nominees in extraordinary circumstances. And the Democrats certainly don't believe that this was the case now. So all bets are off. I think it's a sign, I've been told that to some extent this is a sign from the Republicans that they're looking forward to trying to regain the majority next year, and they're drawing a line in the sand. And as for the Democrats, they knew that he was not going to be confirmed. They drew the foul. It's another notch on their scoreboard for Republican obstructionism, and you know, this is the way it's going to be for the next 18 months.
This nomination was very important in the Asian community.
Yes.
Explain why.
Yeah, well, he would have been the only Asian American serving on the Ninth Circuit Appellate Court, and that appellate court serves 40% of our nation's Asian American population. So this would have been a very big deal.
And what does this say about President Obama's chances of getting anyone through this Senate?
I wouldn't say that nobody else is going to get through. We just had another Asian American district judge nominee, Ed Chen of San Francisco, get confirmed a couple of weeks ago after having waited a lot longer than Goodwin Liu did for his confirmation vote. But I think when things get to the appellate level, it's going to be dicey.
Yeah. So next time we'll talk about what's been going on in the Senate and the closure process.